You're listening to Storytime in Paris on Paris Underground Radio. For more great content and to join our book club, please join us on Patreon. Since well before Victor Hugo looked up at Notre Dame and thought, what if a hunchback lived in there? Authors have been inspired by Paris. Welcome to the Storytime in Paris podcast on Paris Underground Radio, where we keep that tradition alive by showcasing an author with a French connection in each episode. Every episode will feature 5 questions asked by you, our author's biggest fans, and answered live on air. Then our authors will treat us to a reading of an excerpt from their book. I'm your host, Jennifer Garrity. Would you like to join the Storytime in Paris book club? Head on over to patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio and stay tuned to the end of this episode for more information. This week, we're heading a little further afield to the western United States and back in time to the 1930s with our guest, author Rebekah Anderson. Rebekah studied under author E.L. Doctorow, and her writing has received multiple awards and fellowships, including the Summer Literary Seminar in St. Petersburg, Russia. Rebekah's debut novel, The Grand Promise, is a beautifully written, character-driven work of literary fiction, loosely based on her own family history. In examining the real communities impacted by the construction of the Grand Coulee Dam under Franklin D. Roosevelt's presidency, Rebekah challenges us to think about how we react in times of change. Do you cling to the past and the memories of what was? Or do you move forward into the unknown? Please allow me to introduce Rebekah Anderson, author of The Grand Promise. Hello, Rebekah. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Can you start by telling us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yes, I'm Rebekah Anderson. My first novel, The Grand Promise, just came out in the States last month, and I am visiting Paris from Seattle, and I've done some readings this week, which have been really fun, and just really happy to be here visiting this very supportive and very international community of writers and lovers of literature. I've been really blown away by how warm and welcoming everyone is here, and it's been a magical visit.
Oh, that's fabulous. I was going to ask you if there was any sort of particular reception that you were getting here versus maybe in the U.S.
I have felt like there's been a warmer, open reception here than I was expecting, for sure. I think things in the States are a little tenuous still from COVID, and a lot of event spaces and bookstores are still doing virtual or kind of still in a transition to hybrid or in-person events. And so it's an interesting time to have a book come out because the literary community is sort of off kilter a bit from having lived through 2+ years of pandemic.
That makes sense. It's a shame, too, because you said this is your debut novel, which is a huge deal. So congratulations on that.
Thank you.
Can you tell us a little bit about The Grand Promise?
Yes, it's historical fiction, and it is a fictionalized account of the communities that were impacted by the construction of the Grand Coulee Dam. And it takes place in the western United States. And the dam was one of the largest public works projects of that time, and was part of Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal public works projects that were intended to bring jobs to people who'd been out of work for a long time during the Great Depression. So I have fictionalized it and made it personalized to a family, but also it deals with the impact to Native American communities that were on the river, who lost traditional ceremonial sites, burial sites, and fishing locations that were really important to their traditions and survival.
So what is maybe you just answered this already, but what is your connection to Paris or to France?
I've always loved French culture. I studied French in school. It's funny because I was like, oh, this is an exciting opportunity for me to practice my French. And I've been doing Duolingo for months. And I can read it well, and I can, well-ish. I can communicate what I like, ask questions and try to get around. It's really hard for me to understand Parisians when they respond to me, though, because I was taught French by non-native French speakers. And so I just don't have the ear for it. So now I'm feeling really motivated to improve my French. And then I also came here to visit family and friends and wanted to do some readings for the book. And it's been so much fun. I feel truly blessed by this visit.
Had you been here before?
I have. I've been here a couple times before, but as like part of another trip, like a, multiple country trip. So I've only been able to spend a couple days here in the past. So this was pretty luxurious to be able to spend, I think it's 10 days altogether in Paris and kind of live here, test the waters, and I'm kind of hooked. I'm thinking, it's got my brain going about, is there a way I could do this?
Watch out. I mean, that's how it gets you. That's how almost everyone I know ended up here. So
good to know.
So I have collected some questions for you about your book. And one of them is that you mentioned that the story was sort of loosely based on your family history. And I imagine it sounds like it could have been some kind of family folklore. Can you talk a little bit about that and why now seemed like the right time to share the story with the world?
Yeah, I actually the story was inspired by a road trip that I went on with my mom several years ago. And we drove out to Eastern Washington, which is probably 5 hours from my hometown, Seattle, and is a lot more arid and is where the dam is. And so we drove upriver from the dam to where my grandfather was born. And there used to be a family homestead out there. They actually left prior to the dam being built. But she was telling me how the town that he grew up in no longer existed because it was under the lake that was formed by the dam when they backed up the water behind the dam, or backed up the river behind the dam. And I was like, what do you mean it's gone? And she was like, no, it's gone. It's under the river now. And I was just fascinated by this. And so I did some research while we were there. I picked up some books from like the local historical society and interpretive centers that were around that area and just started reading about it. And I was just fascinated by the impact that that project had, and not, within living memory, close to within living memory. And I didn't know anything about it. And I grew up in that area and had never heard of this before. And it felt like a book. It felt like a story that wanted to be told, and that it was rich enough and varied enough and nuanced enough that it could sustain 300 pages, I hope. And why now? I mean, I have been kind of tinkering with this for a long time, and the timing is really about finding someone who wanted to take it on and publish it.
That makes sense.
Also, I have to say, COVID, I don't know that I would have had the time and focus to really finish it, because I had been tinkering with it for years, but COVID gave me some space, less commuting, more time at home to really focus and get it done. So there's one bright thing that came out of that time.
It was surprising to me in the book where the MJ Starks, who's kind of like this fat cat bigwig type, he's just like, well, we're going to flood all your homes and you can either leave or, not, but you don't really have a choice.
Yeah.
That's kind of crazy.
Yeah, it's all pretty factually based. It's fiction, but I did a lot of research to make sure I was being faithful to what really happened in that area.
Interesting. I saw also that you were mentored by E.L. Doctorow. Was he able to read any version of this book?
He was, yeah. I started an early draft of it while I was in the MFA program at NYU. It was such an incredible experience. He was well into his 80s by the time I was in the program, and so he wasn't really around very much. We didn't have a ton of exposure to him, but I did get to work with him he taught a craft class that kind of blew my little writer mind, where he picked his favorite novels, and we had to read a novel a week and give a presentation on them. And presenting your professor's favorite novel to your professor is like several layers of terrifying. But I learned how to speed read. I learned how to quickly get the gist of the structure of a book by just plowing through it. I literally spent spring break in my bedroom, sitting on my bed, plowing through Moby Dick, because we had 2 weeks to read Moby Dick.
Oh my God.
Because we had spring break in the middle of that. And I did it, and now it's one of my favorite books, and I probably would not have had the motivation to get through it if I didn't feel that pressure to, do the homework assignment from my mentor professor. But yeah, then he was my thesis advisor, and he did see an early version of the story. And he gave me some great advice about research, and that research can be a form of procrastination, and to be careful not to get too sucked into being completely factually accurate, or just over researching and rather than writing, that it's enough to be faithful to the truth, but that it's also okay to take some liberties with the story because it is fiction. And I'm glad that he told me that, because at that time I didn't really know how deep I needed to go. Like there was this sort of self-pressure to be an expert on the subject. And he kind of gave me the freedom to let that go and to be a writer who is writing about something that really happened. And I really appreciated that. I had to rely on that many times when I kind of got sucked into, dates and figures. And I'm still terrified that someone's going to ask me a factual question about the dam, and I'm going to be like, how many tons of concrete is it? And I'm like, I should probably know that.
Well, my next question is, how many tons of... I'm just kidding. It makes sense, because in the end, it really is about your imagination more than being a historian. Like, that's why we're reading the book, not for the facts. It's excellent advice. It's also interesting because I can see why you would be attracted to each other's writing. Like, your styles are both very character driven, and while they're set in a specific time and a place, it's through the characters that we learn about the time and place and not the other way around. And speaking of the characters, that my favorite thing about your book and your writing is the characters. I loved spending time with them. I found them so rich and interesting, and Carter, especially the main character, I loved hanging out with him, and when I was not reading, I looked forward to getting to hang out with him again. So some of the characters are quite clear why you included them in terms of like plot. So we've got the Price family, the main family. We've got MJ Starks, who's like the fat cat. We've got Harold, who's a reporter, and they are all quite obvious why we need them in the plot. But then there are some other characters that I just found so compelling. And you mentioned before Joe, the Native American from the Palouse tribe. Can you talk a little bit about why you included him and his relationship to Carter?
Mm-hmm. I realized early on that I couldn't write this book without including someone from the Native American community, because they all were living in the same area and equally, if not more, impacted by the changes that happened in the area. And so I wanted to have that a representative in the story, but also make sure that it was a well-built character and not a stereotype, and and treated well. I actually worked with a sensitivity reader after I wrote really close to the final draft, and she was amazing. Her name's Renee Romanos, and she was able to have some honest exchanges with me about it, and so she was great. And so I felt like I had some input. I also worked with the tribe. They didn't read a draft, but I spoke with them and I used some of their materials to help with some of the factual information about how the Native American community, like the changes that had happened there over a long period of time. They were moved from different traditional village sites overall and consolidated into one reservation years before this happened. And so that history I thought was important. But Joe was a really fun character to write, and I just kind of went for it and made sure to write completely against stereotype with him. He also is kind of a mentor guide figure for Carter. He's much more confident than Carter is, even though he faces a lot more adversity among the other workers. And he has this ability to speak, and he's really articulate. He's well read. He's popular with the ladies, and so I wanted to change that, swap that paradigm of how kind of buddies of the Westerns, or buddy stories of the Westerns, are written, where there's one white character with a Native American character. Joe is really sort of the more dominant personality of the two. But yeah, it was an interesting process. I like him. And thank you so much for that compliment. That is really so great to hear, and I'm really glad you enjoyed it. Did you have any other favorite characters?
I mean, I really enjoyed everyone. Carter was my favorite. I also really liked Charlotte, the woman in the orchard farmer. I always want to say orchid, which is not at all the same thing. The orchard farmer. she was a great character. It was nice. Again, it's a strong, independent woman, also against stereotype, but even in so doing, neither Joe nor Charlotte feel like you're pushing to make them against stereotype either. They feel like grounded people. I mean, I liked Starks too, all of them. Harold, they all had their own, they all seemed it was very clear what each of them wanted, why they were there, who their personalities were. So it was fun to hang out with all of them, honestly.
Yay! Thank you.
Yeah. Does French culture sometimes leave you scratching your head? Well, you might enjoy listening to our sister podcast, Navigating the French, hosted by journalist Emily Monaco. Each episode focuses on a different word in the French language, and Emily is joined by an expert who will help explore what that word says about French culture. Listen now to Navigating the French on ParisUndergroundRadio.com or wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be right back with Storytime in Paris after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Storytime in Paris. So, talking a little bit about the research that you did about the dam and the displacement and all of that, was there anything that you discovered that really surprised you?
There were a lot of things I discovered that surprised me. I relied pretty heavily on this book called Harnessing a Dream. It was written by a history teacher named Paul Pitzer, who was actually one of the blurbers of the book. So one of the things that surprised me was I had always been told growing up that several of the workers were like entombed in the concrete in the dam, and learned that, of course, that is like structurally impossible because it would actually, affect the integrity of the concrete. But more than 75 people died during the construction, mostly from falling from high spots during the construction of the concrete, or falling in the river and getting swept down the river. So that was something new that I learned. Another thing that was interesting that I included in the book was that there were kind of layers of priority when they were hiring workers, and so part of how they minimize some of the impact to the local community was to make highest priority to men who lived in nearby, and then within the state, and then out of the state. And so that was something new that I learned. But yeah, I mean, I felt like every day I was discovering new things about not only the dam itself, but like the history just immediately prior. And if anything, it was like hard to narrow down the number of like interesting facts and anecdotes to include, and to really just kind of like let the story be the story and not try to like not get sucked down a rabbit hole of history.
One of the things that surprised me, and you could tell me whether this is something that was true or something that you invented, but speaking of the people falling into the river, at one point Carter has a job where he's there at night in a rowboat to try to collect anyone who does fall into the river. Was that a real job, or was that a construction of your own?
No, it was a real job.
That's such a morbid job.
There's a lot of invention that went into describing that. It was one of those things where it just was like a footnote in a history book about the catwalk was real too. And that, yeah, they had to have somebody down on the river to for safety purposes. But the whole scenes, I don't know if anybody actually really ever fell off that.
To explain that to the people listening, there was a catwalk that went over the river, and it was like 100-foot fall if you fell off of it. And it was sort of a precarious way to get across. And people would get drunk at night and walk across. And if they were to fall, one of the jobs that Carter has in the book is just to sort of be there at night in a rowboat. And if he hears anything fall, to go and check it out and maybe save it if it's a person.
Right.
Which is very, very, very bizarre and morbid. So your book is really about hope and resiliency, I think. Mm-hmm. But one of your characters, MJ Starks, that I've mentioned before, he repeats something a number of times. And Carter also repeats this a number of times, which is that you have to destroy the past to create the future. Is this a sentiment that you personally agree with?
That's a great question. I guess me as a human, probably not. And that theme was really born out of the destruction of the towns. And Carter is wrestling with some events in his past, and so he kind of does need to destroy the past in order to move on. And so it fit the story, but I honestly don't think a lot about the past other than like in a creative way. I've tried to pose these as questions too. That what is progress? Is it good? Is it bad? Well, it's really neither, and it's both. There's also a lot in there about like how you respond to circumstances that you can't control, and that doesn't make you a good or a bad person. So, I mean, I'm trying to position these as things to think about versus like taking a stance on them. Although I have my own personal philosophies, but I tried to kind of keep that this was meant to be more about questioning those things that maybe we have been told or have assumed. So I think in terms of the narrative, Carter does need to destroy the past, and Stark certainly believes that. There's also the flip philosophy of the people at the fort later, where they think that the past is really useful and shouldn't be wasted. So I feel like that the converse of that is presented too. But yeah, it's fun to play with that stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you make a case for both sides in the book, which is why I thought I would pose it to you. Yeah, it's interesting because it seems in the beginning like it's going to be, especially since in the beginning we hear mostly from Ozzy, who's Carter's dad, and he's very against this. But as the book goes on, you see cases to be made for why this progress is necessary and how it does help things. And it's interesting that it ends up becoming a lot about hope and resiliency and adaptation. And yeah, you have to adapt with the times, and there are things that sometimes you can't change, and you can either just be really grumpy and miserable about it, or you can adapt. So I think you're going to read to us from The Grand Promise.
I am, and that was actually a great setup because the scene that I want to read deals with a lot of those same themes that you just mentioned. So in this scene, this is from chapter 2, and the town the whole community has attended a town hall meeting, and the representatives, so Starks is there from the development company, and also a representative from the Bureau of Reclamation that funded the project. And they have just learned that the town is going to be flooded and that the dam has been approved downriver. And this is taking place in November 1935. The well-dressed man named Stark spoke up. "This town has not been in its prime for decades now, ladies and gentlemen. I dare say you don't have much to lose by moving up the hill a ways. If anything, the town has a better chance of reliving some of its heyday once the irrigation systems are complete and the railroad tracks are laid." A man from the crowd spoke, and even though Carter couldn't see his face, he recognized the voice immediately as his wife's father, Boone Hoffman, who owned a still profitable construction company in town. Carter shrank deeper against the wall, his eyes following the sound of his father-in-law's voice. Right now, the town going away forever sounded like a relief. "Will there be roadwork for experienced contractors?" Starks nodded to Boone in what looked to Carter like feigned sympathy. Starks rose from the table and walked around to the front. Resting his hip against its surface, he leaned forward, opening his hands as though presenting the finale of a magic trick. "You have to think long-term." He addressed the crowd as if he trained his voice for this kind of audience. "This town, this state, and this country are in a situation right now. We all have to think of the long term." Carter could hear men around him grumbling. May looked up at her father while he spoke. Carter's face burned, and he tried to focus on what was being said, but he couldn't stop staring at May. This was exactly why he shouldn't have come. Didn't his father know that? "This is an imperfect moment," Mr. Stark said. "There are sacrifices to be made, and yet there are also great rewards to be had. Many of you have struggled for some time. Your crops suffered from lack of water. Your businesses suffered from lack of customers. The jobs you once counted on are gone. Years ago, this was a town of opportunity with gold and coal and a rail line to ship it out. Now many have already left. Shopkeepers closed their doors. The Grand Hotel that was once a monument to this town's momentum is a museum of its finer past. This moment is imperfect because you will have to choose. Do you cling to the past and the memories of what was, or do you move forward into the unknown?" Stark stood and looked out the window into the distance. Last year, I had the opportunity to attend the World's Fair in faraway Chicago. The day I went, snow dusted the ground, not unlike how it looks outside today. The park and Lake Michigan were gray and blue, the colors of concrete and steel. This entire fair was called Century of Progress, and as I approached the main gate, the archway spanning above my head said in bold letters, "Science finds, industry applies, man adapts." I stopped. He arced his hand in front of him like he was running it over the sign. Science finds, industry applies, man adapts. I had to think about that before I entered the Century of Progress. Was I the kind of man who could adapt? He looked around the quiet room. In the decade or so that engineers and policymakers have been theorizing about how to make better use of the many rivers in this area, one thing has been resoundingly consistent. No one can agree on one clear answer. Now, you may think this proposal means the death of your town. I'm not saying I disagree. For certain, you will have to leave some things behind. Your property, your memories, the shape and proportion of the way it once was. But man adapts. You will either move or be taken by the river. He took his seat again behind the table and glanced at a sheet of paper. The room was held in a reverent silence, and Carter marveled at the hold this man's speech had on them. "I will need thousands of men to help me build this dam," Starks continued. "I will need vendors to supply me with materials to build it. There will be roads and bridges to build, railroad tracks to lay. I will need business owners to provide food, supplies, and entertainment for my workers. Our president plans to be generous with what he offers to compensate you for your land. And Mr. Banks is correct. There is good land not far from here where you can rebuild your town. Yes, this is all good and useful. But what I'm offering is so much more than a new place for an old existence." When President Roosevelt came to visit the site for our new dam, he said it was the best use of everything for all. The future is ours to define, and yours may very well sit 100 miles downriver from here. Only you can decide. A low grumble ran through the room. Mr. Banks from the Bureau of Reclamation looked embarrassed, but Carter was riveted. He hadn't thought of it quite like that. He looked at May, wondering if she heard the same thing he did about the possibility of a fresh start. He remembered lying in bed with her before the house was built, describing the kitchen to her, her cheek resting on his shoulder as she looked up at him with those same wide green eyes. Now she did not return his gaze. "Either way, the decision has been made, and our crews will start blasting," Starks went on. "Those in the floodplain will receive a letter from the federal government indicating when they are to move and the purchase price the government is willing to pay. The president is thinking long-term. The farmers of this region are thinking long-term." Starks spread his hands wide to emphasize his point. "There's no quick fix here, ladies and gentlemen."
Perfect. Thank you so much. So what's next for you? Do you have another book in the works?
I do. I have another novel that is the story of two women who they're like parallel stories of two women living in Europe between the two world wars. And I have about 200 pages of it written, but I put it down to focus on the Grand Promise and getting all my edits done. And now I'm going to pick that back up and work on that one.
That's very exciting. And so where can people find you if they want to keep up to date with what you're doing and your books and all of that?
My website is Rebekah L. Anderson, and I spell Rebekah Rebekah, and then Landerson is my website. Or they can find me on the Instas, @Anderfits is my handle. And I'll post any virtual events or in-person events there on my website and on social media.
Perfect. And I'll include links so that people can get to you really easily. Thank you so much, Rebekah. This was excellent. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you again to Rebekah Anderson for such a wonderful conversation. You can find Rebekah at RebekahLAnderson.wordpress.com and on Twitter and Instagram at Anderfits and on Facebook at Rebekah Anderson Fitzgerald. Please join me next week when my guest will be author Helen Fripp. Check back next week to see if your questions have been answered and to hear a reading from her book, The Painter's Girl. If you'd like to keep the conversation going, please join the Storytime in Paris book club, where you'll meet a different guest author each month and get to speak with them directly about their work. For more information, please visit patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio. I'm your host, Jennifer Garrity, and you can find me on all socials at Jennyforia. That's JennyPhoria, and on my website, jennyforia.com. Storytime in Paris is produced by me as part of the Paris Underground Radio Podcast Network. To check out interviews with previous guests or to discover more great Paris-based podcasts, please visit parisundergroundradio.com. Thank you, and until next time, happy reading! This episode of Storytime in Paris was produced by Jennifer Garrity for Paris Underground Radio. For more on this show and shows like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com.